review on the Clarksburg 10 Mile Creek Limited Amendment. And we have folks from the Planning Board, including Chair Carrier. And we also have Director Wright. And Madam Chair, we will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning and congratulations. We also look forward to another year of working with the County Council on important initiatives. So we're very glad to be here today to give you a presentation on the Clarksburg Minor Master Plan Amendment. And the staff has a more extensive presentation with wonderful slides. I'll just give you the 1-minute intro. What the Planning Board tried to do in this plan was to balance two critical public interests in Clarksburg, one being environmental protection and the other being the community building goals of the 1994 Clarksburg Master Plan. What we feel we have presented is an equitable and scientifically defensible balance between those two goals. We have endorsed the use of impervious limits to protect high-quality streams, just as we've done in other parts of the county. We've set an impervious limit overall for the watershed of 8%, which is lower than in other sensitive parts of the county, such as Upper Rock Creek, but appropriate for one of the county's highest quality streams. We're also recommending strong environmental guidelines for portions of the watershed with the most sensitive streams. And we have classified the area west of I-270 to a rural zone appropriate for its transitional character, but still providing for residential development to meet the needs of the Clarksburg Master Plan. And then east of I-270, we've recommended mixed-use development with higher levels of impervious limits to accommodate the residential and commercial development that will support the Clarksburg Town Center. You'll hear more about the plan from our staff, and we're also here to answer questions. So I'll turn it over to Valdis Lastins, whom you may know, and Mary Dolan on his right, and then you will also hear from Fred Boyd.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to brief you in advance of this evening's public hearing, tomorrow's tour, and then yet another continuation on Thursday of the public hearing. For the record, Valdis Lastins, Chief of Special Projects and Research at Park and Planning. First slide, Fred, please. We have been working on a very interesting project here, interesting plan, under a very aggressive schedule. If you recall, last year we were here before you in October seeking approvals for the approach to the planning process as well as to seek funding for this. The council approved that in late October of last year. We immediately started working on the research, analysis, understanding the changes that have occurred in the Clarksburg planning area since 1994. And we were able to prepare a staff draft plan by July of this year. We held a public hearing on that in September. And the Planning Board transmitted that document to the county exec and the county council in late October. Here we are, December 3rd, preparing for a public hearing tonight as well as Thursday night. And we have planned work sessions with the Fed Committee in January with council action anticipated in February. So it's been a very aggressive schedule. We've made the schedule work. And we think that the Planning Board has developed, as Chair Carrier indicated, a balanced approach to the Clarksburg planning area. In listening to the tapes in discussions with council, I rewound those numerous times to get a better sense of where council members may have been individually on this, and gleaned from those conversations were some important points. One, that this was a limited amendment to the 10 Mile Creek watershed. It was not going to open the entire Clarksburg planning area to study. The importance of involving the public, which we have done on numerous occasions in the Clarksburg planning area. Also looking at protecting the 1994 plan vision while with the community building aspects of that plan while also protecting stream quality, retaining the 1994 commitment to the town center area, the importance of basing planning decisions on science, and to do that we've engaged a consultant team as well as sought input from other county agencies and state agencies and federal agencies. To not look at land use or zoning changes outside the area, the planning area, and not to affect development that had already been approved, and to consider land use and development scenarios that looked at avoiding impacts, mitigating impacts and offsets, and guidelines to arrive at recommendations. If you recall, the 1994 plan focused attention on the development of a corridor town, the importance of a town center that's located to the east of I-270, the importance of the historic core of the Clarksburg planning area, and building on those assets to provide some form of transit in 1994 that was envisioned as a light rail system, and transitioning densities from the east side of I-270 to lower residential development densities on the west side of I-270, and focusing and concentrating employment uses along the I-270 corridor. So that really was the basis for the 1994 plan. Well, what's changed since 1994? One, our charge was to evaluate environmental impacts. Better stormwater management stormwater management systems have improved since 1994 with the application of environmental site design. Through our research and experience, we've seen good results at a site level. However, there has been no long-term research at this point looking at the implications of environmental site design, or ESD, at a large water scale or at a large watershed scale monitoring to understand truly what are the impacts on sensitive stream systems. The other thing that has occurred is there's better knowledge of the impacts of imperviousness. There have been 18 years of monitoring going on in the Clarksburg planning area. Some of the sensitive streams have shown impacts at lower levels of imperviousness, not only here but in other locations in the county. 10 Mile Creek is showing impacts in the headwater areas based on existing development. And the impact of imperviousness is a good indicator of the wide potential range of development impacts on stream quality. The state has also stepped in, stressing the importance of limiting disturbance as part of the toolkit of addressing environmental issues. And then as part of this process, as I mentioned, we've hired a consultant team to look at analysis of the natural resources within the study area. We've also had them undertake a pollutant loading analysis to look at what are the implications of development in terms of water quality based on chemical analysis, and also a hydrologic analysis. So that has changed since 1994. The recommended concept really harkens back to the 1994 plan. It emphasizes emphasizes community building on the east side of I-270 to complement the approved town center, to strengthen the historic district, and to look at a balance of mixed-use development and improvements to the transportation and transit system. To the west of I-270, the emphasis has been more on environmental protection, and that's been achieved by preserving natural resources, maximizing the amount of undeveloped open space, as Chair Carrier indicated, minimizing impervious cover in certain areas, and retaining the important housing resource as a community building component in Clarksburg. So to summarize the recommendations of the Planning Board draft, it's really a balance of public interest, looking at environmental protection as well as community building. The overall impervious level for the watershed has been maintained at approximately 8%, less than other sensitive stream systems like Upper Rock Creek. The area east of I-270 has been designated for mixed-use development to accommodate residential and commercial development to support the Clarksburg Town Center, not to compete with it. Density and development footprints were reduced west of I-270 to increase undeveloped open space areas and to protect stream quality. And the impervious limits match differing land use objectives. So you'll see differences as the plan is described to you. And again, strong environmental guidelines to provide direction for water quality, plan review, and forest conservation. That's a kind of a snapshot of where we've been. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mary Dolan.
Good morning, or afternoon, morning, I guess it's still morning. Mary Dolan, Chief of Functional Planning and Policy at the Planning Department. I want to first orient you to the area. You can see outlined in red the planning area boundary that we used, which is basically the watershed boundaries of the 10 Mile Creek area. You can see Interstate 270, which crosses the headwaters of 10 Mile Creek. 355, which is the parallel route through the town center and the historic district. 121, which comes from the north, crosses over I-270 and extends along the eastern boundary of the planning area. Old Baltimore Road, which comes into the planning area from the east and goes to the ford across 10 Mile Creek and then on to the other side of the planning area. Shiloh Church Road, which is the basically the boundary between the Ag Reserve and the remainder of Clarksburg. Then Stringtown Road is now the main route east-west that connects to I-270. So that's the general orientation. You can see the previously adopted parks following the stream through the middle. The existing parks are shown in dark green, proposed parks in light green. This plan proposes to amend those park boundaries. I'll show those to you later, but that's just for orientation. The Cabot Branch development in what's called the Clarksburg Triangle is just outside of 10 Mile Creek, and both that development and the improvements to Clarksburg Road are all draining into Cabot Branch, not into 10 Mile Creek. So that development is not affecting immediately the planning area.
Ms. Dolan, I think we have a question.
Sure.
Councilmember Irvin.
I was going to try to wait, but I'm trying to get my orientation straight. This is not an area
This is
that I
important, yes.
represent. Obviously, it's on the far other end of the county from me. So is this whole area in the red considered environmentally sensitive?
Yes, it's all part of the same watershed. It all drains to 10 Mile Creek and eventually to Little Seneca Lake.
Okay, so can you point out where 10 Mile Creek is here?
Yes. You can probably see it a little better in the next slide, but Fred can point out the main stem, which flows down through what was proposed parkland. It has many tributaries that form like fingers up into all the areas surrounded. It flows from the north to the south.
Okay,
Okay.
that's helpful.
And
All
we'll-
those little blue things are the tributaries.
Right. You may not be able to see them very well.
That-
Maybe
and
better on the
these
next.
tributaries and 10 Mile Creek flow into a larger body, Seneca
Lake.
which is a water supply? Is
They-
that what we're hearing this? So this is a really good
I
place
actually
for me
that
to
will-
begin to
that-
ask these questions. Okay.
If you just give me one more
I will,
moment, in
Mary.
2 slides you will
Thank you.
see. Yeah, next one. Now this breaks down the sub-watersheds, and I'll take a few minutes to go over this because it's important. You can see the streams and their tributaries, the flowing from basically from the upper right down to the center at the bottom of the slide. The uppermost watershed is what's called LSTM 206, or just 206 for abbreviations. The abbreviations mean Little Seneca 10 Mile, and then 206, that's a second order stream, which means it's got other streams flowing into it. You can see there are several small streams that flow into it. This is the subwatershed that contains the area that's most directly related to the town center. It's also the area that has the most existing imperviousness. It's about 16% impervious now, which is pretty high, and it still has quite a bit of undeveloped land in it. It also has the biggest portion of I-270 in it. So this is the area that's most highly impacted and will probably, under this plan, sustain more impacts because of the need to have the development related to the town center. So that's 206. 201 is a much larger subwatershed. It contains portions of the Egan property, if anybody's familiar with High Point Farms Catering or Egan Barbecue. Most of the property is located in that area. In fact, the high point of High Point Farms is the ridge between those two subwatersheds. But most of that subwatershed is in rural or ag preservation zoning, and it's most of it is forest or farm. Moving southward, LSTM 202 is receives the water from 206, is mostly forested. Much of this is owned by the county, this particular subwatershed. Also, the detention center, you might point out, Fred, is right near I-270, also on that ridge line between 201 and 206, on the west side of I-270. So those are what we would call the headwater watersheds of 10 Mile Creek. Then, just to look briefly to the far west, in the Ag Reserve, 203 and 204 we're not proposing any change. Those are in the Ag Reserve. They're going to stay in the Ag Reserve. On the east side, LSTM 110 and 111 are the most sensitive subwatersheds in this overall watershed of 10 Mile Creek. They're small tributaries. They currently have very low imperviousness. They currently have very high quality streams. In fact, I think LSTM 110 is in excellent condition. So those are the ones that are most concerning to us. Most of the Pulte development property that is Pulte and King Properties control are located in those two subwatersheds. So you'll hear me talk about 110 and 111. The others, 302 and 303B, are main stem subwatersheds. They receive water from all these other subwatersheds, so they're affected by them in varying degrees depending on where the streams join the main stem. LSTM 112 is also, about half of that is on the Pulte and King properties. It flows farther down, farther south, nearer the lake. But all 206, 110, 111, and 112, and 201 are all headwater watersheds in the sense that they don't receive water from any other subwatershed. 202, 302, and 303B, and 304 all have other branches feeding into it. So that's just an overall of 10 Mile Creek, and now I'll show you the slide of the Little Seneca Reservoir and tell you a little bit about that. You can see in the green is the area I've just described.
Ms. Tolan, I think Councilmember Irvin has another question.
One more.
No,
And
no
I hope
problem.
it's helpful that I'm asking the question because I don't know the answer. Describe again for me what is a headwater. What does it mean?
It's the first place that water falls in a watershed. Everything runs downhill, just like my arm here, so that if water fell on this finger, it would join water from this finger, water from this finger, water from this finger, into the quality of, let's say, my forearm here. So anything that's happening in these headwaters has a greater effect because it travels a farther distance. Also, these areas, because they're so small, are affected more directly by any development around them. Once you get farther downstream, there's much more water, more potential for dilution, more potential for other watersheds that are maybe less developed to dilute, to buffer the water farther downstream. So these areas are small, they're sensitive to change, and they affect all the water downstream from them. So that's the definition of headwaters.
And they affect the other water in what way? Again, I'm sorry.
They either contribute to its health or contribute to its detriment
Okay.
in terms of what's, how well they're protected.
Okay, thanks.
If they're heavily impacted, it's going to impact the rest of the stream. If they're very well protected, it's going to help protect the stream. So in this, I'm happy to answer more questions.
Councilmember Berliner just answered the question the way I needed it answered.
Okay.
He said what
He's
goes
on our
in,
team.
He goes, what goes into the stream is sediment.
Sediment
And that
and,
was
and
important.
nutrients.
And nutrients, okay.
And other pollutants such as salts or things that might come off of automobiles or pesticides, things like that that might be
Thank you.
running into the stream. So just think of the stream as a bowl, and that anything that falls on the edges of it is going to
Going
go
down.
into the stream. So thinking of that bowl as Little Seneca Lake, in this picture you can see the dark portion of the aerial photograph is the lake itself. That lake has a fairly large watershed, about 12,500 acres, of which the area that we are talking about is about 3,200 acres, or about a quarter. That watershed is also extends into Germantown Town Center, a good portion of the northwestern portion of Germantown, up against Black Hills Regional Park. All that area flows into the lake. Then also most of the Clarksburg development, both existing and proposed, also flows into Little Seneca Lake. So you can see the general area, that's the bowl, all drains to Little Seneca Lake. Little Seneca Lake is a reservoir as part of our whole drinking water system. It's used as a it's used as a supplemental water supply. Water from the dam during times of drought is released to Little Seneca Creek, flows along with everything else that drains to Seneca Creek and Great Seneca Creek farther downstream, so all the way through the western part of the county, flows into the Potomac River, combines with the flow of the Potomac River, flows several miles downstream to our intake at the base of Watts Branch.
Oh.
So the water is taken in from that point. No water from this reservoir is taken immediately into drinking water. Plus everything, of course, that comes from the Potomac is treated at our Potomac filtration plant.
Ms. Tolan, we have a couple lights on.
Sure.
First is Councilmember Florine.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about what's around the reservoir? What's the development pattern around the reservoir
Sure.
itself?
Yes. You can see Fred will indicate in the lower right, that is the portion of Germantown that is north of 118, includes the town center.
So that's the town center.
Includes the town center and most of the area around Waters Landing and Crystal Rock.
So it has all those multifamily and apartment,
Yes.
multifamily apartments and townhouses right next to the reservoir down in
Yes.
downtown Germantown, right?
Yes. And also, most of the development existing and proposed in Clarksburg in the upper right is also in the watershed.
But how much of Germantown is within the watershed?
I don't have that exact figure, but I'd guess maybe 20%, 15 or 20% of
So where would you
Of
consider
Germantown.
the line? So 270 sort of goes to the middle of this, right?
Right.
And then everything, where all those other tributaries are,
Correct,
they're all tributaries to Little Seneca as well.
correct.
And that's where, I can't quite
It's a little
see
hard to
in terms
see,
of
I
the
know.
development patterns. Well, let me say that when we get to this in committee, if we can have something that
A
shows.
little more detail.
Yeah, sort of the land use allocation around the variety of tributaries that serve Little Seneca. I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Councilmember Leventhal. We have a number of lights on. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I really appreciate Councilmember Irvin, her questions, and Councilmember Florine's clarification here. I want to go ahead, Mary, and let you get to your third bullet, and then if I can reserve my time, because the bullet says the development should result in similar volumes and quality of water delivered to the reservoirs today. I just wanted to be in line on this issue of drinking water, but if you could make that bullet point, and if I could come back.
I would like to offer Gwen Wright the chance to speak, and then I'll follow up.
The only thing I just want to continue, I want to just reinforce what Mary said earlier, which is this is not a reservoir in the traditional sense that people think of reservoirs, where you go and you take water out of the reservoir, treat it, and drink it.
When you say this, you mean Little Seneca Lake?
Little Seneca.
Which is fed from the entire watershed, not
Correct.
only 10 Mile Creek.
It is a drinking water resource in the sense that if we have a period of drought, water from Little Seneca can be released and can flow many miles down into the Potomac River and then be mixed with the water in the Potomac River to add quantity to the water in the river that gets treated and that is used as drinking water.
When's the last time that happened, Gwen?
Oh my gosh, I think,
In the 90s,
yeah.
1990s, 1990.
It was
Or
early
maybe.
90s, yeah. So I do.
It's happened, I believe, 3 or 4 times, and I can get
In
specific.
history?
In history.
A total of 3 or 4 times?
Yeah.
Yes.
And I do want to make the distinction, we do have in Montgomery County reservoirs that actually are reservoirs in the traditional sense where you take the water out of that body of water and use it. Tridelphia, for example, where WSSC
Rocky
has a
Gorge.
facility, is a reservoir, and the water in Tridelphia is actually used for drinking right from Tridelphia. This water is used to increase the quantity during periods of drought. And I think that's just a very important distinction that people need to understand.
Also, to highlight that as well, it's not only, it's actually a stopgap, because we really depend on water from the Jennings-Randolph reservoir much farther
Way, way
upstream.
right.
But in order for a quick response, when we need water in a hurry, they release it from Little Seneca as a stopgap measure until that water can flow all the way down from Jennings-Randolph. I'm
Okay, we
sorry.
have 2 other lights on.
Still-
Oh, I'm sorry,
yeah.
Councilman.
I wanted
So
to,
if you could make
I will
that
handle
point,
the
Mary,
last bullet,
point,
and then we
right.
can handle any additional questions. The studies that we did looked at the pollutant loadings and the sediment loadings from the area that we're talking about only, not the remainder of the reservoir, but only the area shown in light green here. And the pollutant loadings and the sediments, because the area is farmed now, it does receive sediments from the plowing of the land or the pasturing of the animals as they move through the fields, as well as nutrients from either fertilizers that is applied or manure from the pastured animals that flows to the creek, eventually to the lake. So there is a pollutant loading existing there today. When we did the modeling for the development that that is being proposed here, it would have a similar effect. Different in the fact that it's, instead of farm fields, it would be lawns and homes, but roughly the same amount of sediment and the same amount of pollutants would be added to the stream as there are now. There's some differences, fewer sediments because you don't have the plowing, maybe a little more nutrients because there might be more fertilization. That's always a variable depending on how people treat their property and how much is managed by HOA or versus personal lawns and so forth. Also, the volume of water which volume is really the main issue, as Gwen was emphasizing here. We would expect that the volume of water in terms of runoff and in terms of flow from groundwater would be quite similar. It might flow at different times, slightly during a rainstorm, depending on the stormwater management that's applied, but the same amount of water would be delivered to the reservoir. There should be no change in that whatsoever. So that's a summary of the consultant's analysis, which I'm sure we will present to the Fed Committee in greater detail, but I'd like to answer questions now.
Okay, so we've got Councilmember Leventhal reclaiming his time.
So, we're going to get a lot of testimony tonight. And I wish, and maybe it's fruitless to wish, that there was some way to structure a dialogue with our constituents that bring out the facts that you all have just outlined. On Thanksgiving Day, council members and a lot of members of the public got an email on this topic, and the title of the email was, "Hey, I was drinking that." Well, nobody was drinking that. Now, we'll make wise decisions, prudent decisions for the future of this county here on this dais. But when you are getting messages that aren't descriptive of facts, it just becomes really difficult to make wise and prudent decisions in the face of information that is not true. And I just wish there was, we're not going to argue with our constituents tonight. We're not really even going to correct facts tonight. We'll listen to the testimony. I can only imagine what it's going to be like. And of course, there's certainly valid reasons to preserve and protect environmentally sensitive watershed areas regardless, but nobody was drinking that. The water hasn't been released since the 1990s. Nobody was drinking that. And to get a headline like that causes me chagrin. All my colleagues here, and I think all my constituents have great respect for facts, and yet we seem to be in an environment, sort of a fact-free environment, and it causes me great concern. It causes me great concern.
Councilmember Andrews.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking forward to the public hearing tonight. I don't know what we're going to hear. We got, I think, a pretty diverse group of people coming to speak to us, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. And I anticipate there'll be a lot of excellent testimony from many, many people. Couple questions. One is, what is the difference in the amount of time it takes to go from Jennings-Randolph in terms of the water flow down the Potomac to the treatment areas and to the south end versus the time it takes to go for water to flow from the Little Seneca Reservoir to the Potomac?
I think from Little Seneca, I think it's within 24 hours. I think it's 3 to 5 days from Jennings-Randolph. I'm not 9 days? I would get the precise, it's a number of days, so obviously you have to cover for a number of days, but within 24 hours you can get water from Little Seneca if it's needed. All of this is controlled by the Interstate Commission for the Potomac River Basin, and they work with the Corps of Engineers and with WSSC to try and understand in times of drought what the water balance is, what the flows might be on a particular day or for a particular period of time, and they plan for that. But but they need this reservoir as a way to manage in a more timely fashion. But it's a number of days before it comes from
All right, it'd be
Jennings
useful to
Randolph.
get that pinned down.
I
It's a
will.
big difference. And there was a significant drought in the area, I think it was 2003. It was earlier this, well, in the last decade, but I'm trying to recall what year it was. If you can give us information about what are the dates, what times has the
Sure.
reservoir been used for that purpose of restoring water to the Potomac until the water, a week or so later from Jennings Randolph comes down from West Virginia to the area. I think that would be useful as well. I looked through the slides that we have here, and I wanted to ask if there is a slide that directly addresses the question, and you may be getting to it, of what is the anticipated effect on the water quality of 10 Mile Creek itself from the proposal versus the water quality that would eventually be seen in the reservoir.
I don't have a slide on that, but I can speak to it when we get to the imperviousness.
Okay.
Descriptions.
All right, I'll wait. Thank you.
Okay.
Councilmember Berliner.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Dolan, just to correct the record, this will be a joint committee meeting.
Oh, thank you. Excellent.
yes.
That's wonderful.
It was and I appreciate the fact that it is going to be a joint committee meeting. When we asked you to do this work, we did so because of the environmental considerations, so I appreciate the fact that the Environment Committee will be meeting with the Fed Committee with respect to this matter and be making our joint recommendations as to how to proceed.
That's great.
Let me ask you for a quick follow-up with respect to the drought issue. Many of us are deeply concerned about climate change, and most people believe that climate change will have an impact on issues like drought. To what extent did you take that into consideration in terms of your analysis?
We did look at the information that's been provided by ICPRB and their projections of the effect of climate change. Unfortunately, climate change, if to the extent that it occurs, is going to affect development, whether it's no development, no build in this area, or whether there are homes and businesses in this area. So the effect, as I said in this third bullet, since the volumes would be similar under the existing condition and what is proposed in the planning board draft, you would expect to see if there's more droughts, you're going to have the same effect on the reservoir, volume in the reservoir, and the need for the reservoir, regardless of the built condition or no built condition in the watershed. So what the effect that you would have, if, let's just say, that climate change results in more frequent drought conditions, then potentially we would be relying on volume from this reservoir more often. That would be, but the amount of development in the watershed probably won't affect that one way or the other.
I understand that as an independent variable, the amount of
Yes.
development does not. To the extent to which there has been concern about the impact on the reservoir, however, and the use of the reservoir, the drought would have a bearing, as you
Yes,
observed,
absolutely.
with respect to
It would
that.
potentially be used more frequently.
I appreciate your observations as to what happens to that water from the reservoir and how it then gets sent to treatment plants, et cetera. But in terms of the narrow issue of droughts and the use of this particular facility, it does seem as if climate change could have a bearing on how often that facility is used going forward for
Absolutely.
that purpose. Let me just make a larger observation, part because the conversation has seemed to have gotten a little larger, and that is with the balancing of public interests as you divined it in terms of what the council's desire was in terms of environment versus, quote, community building. I want you to know that as the one who argued strenuously for sending this to you to open it up, my consideration was 99% with respect to the environment. So the community enhancing, community building piece of it was not part of my consciousness. It may well have been part of other people's consciousness on this council, and it could be an important aspect of our debate. But in terms of balancing the public interests here, I do not consider them to be of equal significance to this particular decision. And I will be looking to hear going forward from our staff and others as to the impact of that, quote, balancing on the effects on the environment.
All right, Ms. Dolan, you can go ahead and
Okay.
continue.
Sure. As Mr. Lasdens spoke about, we did have a number of consultant studies done by a team of highly respected and well-based folks who have done quite a bit of work in the county, and the joint committees will hear from them. But I'm just highlighting the conclusions of their analysis here today. The first thing they talked about was minimizing the disturbance of the existing natural resources and restoring to the extent possible areas that have been damaged either by agricultural use or roads and such that might have been constructed before stormwater management, looking at ways to both minimize the disturbance and restore the damage. That includes preserving a complex of forest interior areas and stream buffers, reforesting stream buffers affected by agriculture and existing development. There are a number of those in the watershed. Establishing buffers around what we call ephemeral streams. Now, ephemeral streams are the even smaller drainage areas, the very first point where water collects, maybe like talking about the capillaries of your blood system. Very small drainage areas that are not currently protected under our stream buffer requirements because they only flow during rainstorms. They're not what we call perennial streams. So looking at protecting those, reducing the footprint of the proposed Maryland 355 bypass. I'll show you that when we talk about transportation. There's a bypass proposed to extend from Observation Drive and reconnect up to 355 in the north. That crosses several tributaries in the headwaters. So anything that we could do to minimize the effect of that and the effect of sewer lines that have to cross. These are things that have to cross streams. Everything else we keep outside of the stream buffer, but obviously utilities and infrastructure do have to cross the streams. Then they also said to focus and prioritize development east of I-270. That's where, as I said, existing conditions are somewhat degraded in that area. If you're going to put additional development, that's probably a place that you can tolerate that additional development. And to the extent possible, reduce development west of I-270, the area that is currently mostly farmland and is proposed as a housing resource. Those are the areas that we should look at reducing development if possible. As I talked about 110 and 111, those small tributaries, if development occurs in there, they wanted us to reduce the limits of disturbance there, cluster the development as much as possible, keep as much of the natural resources as possible, particularly in those two subwatersheds, and to limit imperviousness to a greater extent in the sensitive areas in the watersheds to the west, and to a lesser extent east of I-270. So minimizing imperviousness and minimizing disturbance go hand in hand. They're two different things. You would, let's just say you would clear and grade a fairly large area when you're doing a development. Then once you've developed it, some of that area becomes lawns, landscaped areas, HOA properties, and so forth, because it's not, doesn't have a hard surface, a road, a building, or something on it. So there's an area of disturbance which is larger, and then an area of imperviousness that's usually within that area of disturbance. So those were the things that they asked us to focus on. They said those are the things that would be most protective of the natural resources. So this is a table that kind of summarizes the range of options and looks at on the left-hand side at the specific properties and groups of properties, and then a couple of factors on the bottom in terms of imperviousness. And then the columns, the no build, basically existing conditions under today's, what the planning board is recommending, and then what the 1994 plan recommended. And those go from obviously lower risk if you're looking at existing conditions to higher risk, which was the 1994 plan, which is the reason that the council asks us to look at this plan, look at a way to find something that is less impactful to the watershed, but still accomplishes the needs of the community. So just to take these roughly across, the Egan property, Egan Barbecue, High Point Farms, would have to, under a no-build, would have to become a park or kept as a barbecue operation, basically, with no additional imperviousness. Under the planning board, we're keeping what was in the 1994 plan as an underlying zone of R200 and asking to limit the imperviousness to 25%. The 1994 plan recommended a floating zone of a PD4, which would yield approximately 28% imperviousness. Miles Coppola, which is the property that is currently optioned by the Peterson Company and currently proposed, or they are proposing it as a specialty retail development, would, of course, under no build, have to remain undeveloped. The planning board recommends the CR zone, and Fred will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. With a 25% imperviousness, the 1994 plan recommended MXPD on that property, again a floating zone, yielding approximately 26% imperviousness. The fire station, which is proposed along 355.
Clarification, I apologize.
Yes.
Sure.
I found, could you go back to Miles Coppola and show us where that is on the watershed? Because I don't think you identified it at that point in time, so.
Absolutely. Correct. Egan is to the north, and Miles Coppola is that largely forested area to the south. And we'll have some more detailed maps in a few moments.
Thank you.
But that's its general location there. And Fred, might you also just identify the overall county properties, just the larger area? And then the Pulte property, Pulte King properties, just so you get a general sense of where those are. Thank you.
All right, we have Councilmember Reamer that had a question. Do you want to go
Yes.
ahead and ask your question now, or? Okay,
Okay.
all right.
Again, the fire station would be built under any scenario that we assumed that. Again, these are things we actually tested, and when you look at some of the charts, you'll see these reflected. The historic district we allowed to develop under all scenarios. The bypass, under the no build, we looked at not building the bypass, but under either of the other two, obviously that would be built. Clarkwood, which is between the county properties and Pulte, the county, when they purchased property for what was proposed for the depot, took basically the impervious privileges from that property away and guaranteed the potential for the development on their portion of the property. They subdivided off this smaller piece of property, so it currently has no real development potential. But under the 1994 plan, it did have the RE1 TDR designation there. Public sewer to the historic district has to be provided either by the county through 355 with a pumping station. I think DEP has presented this to you before, or as it's proposed in the 1994 plan and in the planning board draft, to be provided by, basically by the Miles Coppola development, by the, if Peterson were to develop the Miles Coppola property, it would be providing service to the historic district. Without that development, that service would have to be provided by the county. The county depot property.
Stolen, can I stop you there for a moment? Because
Sure.
I think that that's an important point for some of my colleagues who might not understand the plight that's facing our historic district when it comes to septic systems. So if you could shed a little light on that, particular
to.
in terms of what we're facing currently with the historic district and its access to public sewer.
Sure, certainly. Fred, could you go back to the sub-watershed slide again? There we go. The historic district sits on a ridge because, as we know, most roads are built on ridges in Montgomery County. They're, at least the historic roads are built on ridges. It is also out, it's in the 10 Mile Creek watershed, so water drains away from the approved development in Clarksburg, from the phase 2 and phase 3 development in Clarksburg. This is, remember, stage 2 and stage 3. This is stage 4. So because of the drainage boundaries, in order to serve the historic district, you would have to, if you're going to connect it to the existing sewers in the developed portion of Clarksburg, you would have to pump it out of the 10 Mile Creek watershed into the Little Seneca watershed. If development occurs as it was proposed in the 1994 plan and is proposed under the planning board draft in 10 Mile Creek, that sewerage, once it's provided to the historic district, right now they have no sewerage. They have, some of them have leaking septic systems. Some of them simply can't expand their properties because they're limited by the existing septic systems. In order for those areas to be served by gravity, they would have to be served via any development on the Miles Coppola property. That would basically be the sort of elephant to carry the historic district along with it. So that's.
So in essence, if I just can summarize, what you're saying is that failing septics, leaking septics that are leaking into this sub-watershed where we're concerned about water quality are dependent upon development, Miles Coppola property, to connect them to public sewer so that they don't leak into the sub-watershed. So we actually need the development in order to keep waste and other nutrient loading going into the sub-watershed. Would that be correct?
Yes, unless, of course, the county were to decide they would prefer to pump it out into the existing sewer system. So
Excellent.
again, that would be a long-term, a capital commitment and a long-term issue.
Councilmember Berliner.
Just a clarification.
Sure.
Describe that option again, if you would. If the county, let's assume for purpose of this conversation that the Miles Coppola property was not developed.
Yes.
And
in
if we
fact,
wanted to provide sewage services
to the historic
to the
district.
historic district, tell us what that option looks like that would have the least impact from an environmental perspective.
Well, it would be, and DEP has been looking at this for a number of years and exploring it. I'm sure they've briefed Councilmember Rice on a number of occasions. In fact, we were looking at it, providing it in conjunction with the fire station. The fire station is sort of in almost the northern edge. It's not in the historic district, but adjacent to it. The sewer service would be provided via 355 in the road right-of-way. It would be pumped to a point near where the Bennigan's is now, and then cross over to the east and connect into the sewerage system there. The county, I think, has been working with WSSC and has priced this out. I've forgotten what the exact numbers are. I'm sure they will be available to make a full presentation to the committee, joint committees. But that would be an expensive proposition, number one. It would require perpetual pumping, which is also an expenditure of energy. And it would have to be provided by the county at the county's expense with WSSC and whatever agreements they have to do that. And it would also probably be fairly expensive for the property owners to hook up. The charges and the costs of hooking into the sewer system are not in any manner a minor amount of money. It's in the multiple tens of thousands of dollars to connect to the system. If it's provided by the developer, those costs would be defrayed. I don't know to what extent, but they would probably be less.
On the limited issue of environmental impacts, I thought you had described the county option as, quote, pumping water out of the watershed, if you will. So I wanted to make sure I understood what that term meant and its impact on 10 Mile Creek or water quality sets of issues.
It would simply take the sewerage from the homes or businesses and in a pressure sewer, pump them into the sewerage system that already exists in Clarksburg. You would have much less environmental impact. You would be going along the roadway and the right-of-way. You would not be going down having to cross any streams and so forth. Now, we've been working with WSSC on the alternatives for actually providing the gravity sewer. There are ways that stream crossings and incursions in the stream buffer can be minimized, but not eliminated. So there would be, if you sewer the area by gravity, more environmental impact to the stream than there would be if you did the pumping option and were only serving homes right along 355.
Just to state something that may not be completely obvious, the gravity system is what we would expect a developer to provide, and then you would hook the homes into the gravity system. What the county would have to provide, since would only be for the historic district, would be the pumping system where you're using, I guess, an electric system to literally pump sewage uphill rather than allowing it to flow downhill.
I would thank the council president for his indulgence. As I
But also
understood, go ahead.
just to be clear also, the gravity system as it is currently proposed would eventually also require a pump station because we are not gravity flowing all the way down 10 Mile Creek through all those sensitive resources. The proposal always has been in the 1994 plan and today to pump that sewerage eventually either into the Seneca system on the east side of I-270 or into the Cabin Branch system on the west side. So the real concern is to certainly minimize the number of pumping stations. That's always an issue, both respect with energy conservation and with respect to cost and maintenance for those pumping stations.
So to follow the council president's lead with respect to summarizing your answer, as I appreciate it, from an environmental perspective, the county providing this service could have less environmental impact than otherwise, but there are legitimate cost considerations with respect to it that have to be
Absolutely.
explored. So I would just ask, I see Mr. Lachenko listening to this conversation, and I would expect that our joint committee would have a full understanding of the impact of this factor on our deliberations as we go forward. Thank you.
Excellent. So I have a number of lights that have now come on. Is it regarding this particular point? Okay. All right, Councilmember Leventhal.
Well, certainly with respect to sewerage, it's appropriate that Fed and T&E meet jointly on this, but from the years I spent on T&E, it has not been the county's practice to rescue property owners with failing septic systems. Right. And if we begin in Clarksburg, we've had years of complaints from the property owners in the Clarksburg Historic District. And if we now say, well, you know what, we'll just take that over, and all taxpayers of the county will be responsible for your failed septic system, there's an awful lot of property owners elsewhere in the county who also have failed septic systems,
Yes.
who also don't want to pay for them, who the county has turned down over and over when they've requested to get on sewer. So if we set the precedent in Clarksburg of saying it is now the responsibility of all taxpayers to assist a few property owners with failed septic systems, I assure you that opens the door to a lot of petitions from other property owners with failed septic systems all over Montgomery County. So we're going to have to think that one through very carefully.
I agree.
I want to, now, may I raise a different topic?
Let me just find out. Councilmember Florine has one on this issue. Councilmember Florine has one on this
Well, I
issue, so
wanna
let's let her,
join
and then you can
Councilmember
reclaim.
11th on this subject, as folks who've dealt with this in the T&E committee for years and years and years, we have yet, and Keith can shake your head, right? We have struggled with this problem. Failing septic systems are a huge issue. You will remember we have the Glen Hills study to address. Who pays? And I'm sure the other members of the T&E committee, current T&E committee, will recall the challenges of figuring this out in our annual budget analysis with respect to sewer systems. It's a huge issue. We have been hearing from the small little businesses here for many, many years in Clarksburg, and this is not a simple suggestion of, oh, the county pays for it. The county won't pay for it. That's just a fact. So let's not say that, and accept the fact that this is a problem that we have an obligation to address one way or the other. That has been one of the challenges with the staging in the plan itself. And I'm one of the last ones standing with respect to the 94 plan because I was on the planning board when we sent that up here. It got changed at the council in 1994. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter is these issues have been pending for many, many years, and they are not simple toss-offs. And I just wanted to also just emphasize the whole issue of there are going to be two water quality issues, I guess, the stream water quality issue and the reservoir issue. And because we're going to have, I think, 2 sessions just on the science, right, Marlene? Let's make sure that we have a full understanding of how this reservoir works, the whole shebang. So, thank you.
All right, before I turn to Councilmember Leventhal, I just want to remind our colleagues that the time is now a little past 11:45, and I know we have a number of other slides, but I'll go ahead and call on Councilmember Leventhal, and if we can try and get through the presentation and hold our remaining questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. Could we go back to the chart of the no-build option, the Planning Board's recommendation, and the 1994 recommendation? On the issue of TDRs, I would like to get a sense when we get into committee of sort of what is the relationship between the TDRs that have been in the marketplace, our expectation of how much farmland we're going to protect, and what receiving areas are left in Montgomery County. And we'll have a thorough discussion in committee, but this was intended to be, in the 1994 plan, a TDR receiving area. And the planning board isn't recommending that, and there are community members who have said not one stick should be built, not one house, not one thing, anywhere. And maybe that's where we'll end up. And so maybe this won't be a TDR receiving area, and maybe every single place in Montgomery County proposed for development will end up not being developed as a result of, community concern, and there won't be any TDRs. And if there aren't, then maybe there will be a whole lot of houses built in the RDT zone, because it'll be more valuable to build houses than not to be able to sell TDRs. So this issue is a large policy issue that we need to be thinking about. Where do we stand now with respect to supply and demand and the availability to sell these TDRs? You, the planning board, are not recommending that it be a TDR receiving area anymore. Am I correct?
No, that is correct, and it's something that we discussed. We were very mindful of the fact that we were making that change. We made that change, I would say, partly in recognition of the fact that we were recommending a significant decrease in the density possible on the property that used to have a TDR recommendation. And if we had maintained a TDR zoning, the property owners in that area would have had to go buy more TDRs in order to build fewer homes.
And that would have resulted in protecting more farmland. So just for those, the benefit of those watching at home, transferable development rights, TDRs, are an agreement that the county struck 40 years ago with farmers in order to prevent the subdivision of farmland. Farmers sell these transferable development rights, and then they are received in the developed parts of the county. So we've made the trade-off historically that in order to maintain an agricultural reserve, we will allow more development in parts of the county that are not located in the agricultural reserve. And one of the mechanisms whereby that occurs is TDR's, transferable development rights. And so we just need to be aware, if we're going to downzone this area out of concern for the environment, the septic issue is one, the TDR issue is another, where there may be negative environmental consequences, unforeseen consequences of taking what looks like an environmental move in this sensitive watershed. If you prohibit development here, you may be shutting off the possibility of correcting failed septic systems, which are environmentally hazardous, and you may be shutting off the opportunity to receive TDRs, which may mean that more farmland gets developed in the long run. It's just, you know, the possibility of unforeseen consequences we need to keep in mind.
I would note that we were also, were also sort of kept in mind that the CR zones open up a new market for TDRs, which did not exist when the TDR program was created.
So I'd like to understand, if we could get sort of an inventory
Because
of
we
what
now-
other options are available.
We now have, people can get public benefit points for purchasing TDRs, regardless of what kind of
Yes.
building that they're doing.
Right.
And so that greatly expands who can purchase TDRs.
Well, yes, but that's also under intense debate right now in the zoning rewrite. So yesterday, the planning board
Not sure
recommended to
that particular point
the
is.
conversion of C zones to CR zones, which was proposed by the planning board. The planning board backed away from yesterday and recommended instead NR zones in the C zones and not CR zones. And I assume that NR zones would not be TDR receiving areas. Am I correct about that?
Gosh, you've gone beyond my knowledge
Okay,
of
so
the
we
NR
just-
zone. But the land that we have already zoned to CR already is an expansion of the
Well, that's what I'm asking
opportunities
for, is
the
to get a better
purchase of
sense of the
TDRs.
inventory there.
We can certainly do that.
Ms. Michelson?
Yeah, I just want to clarify, if the council changes the number of TDR receiving areas, that will not in any way impact the amount of housing development in the agricultural reserve. What it will impact is the ability of property owners in the reserve to be compensated for the TDRs. So it doesn't change the development there, but it does change the dynamics of a system that was set up by which those farmers could be compensated for homes they could no longer build.
We'll need to understand that better too, because there was a contract that stated that in return for not subdividing their land, they would sell those TDRs. If the TDRs can't be sold, it does bring the contract into question. So we'll have to understand that better as well.
I'd be happy to.
Excellent. Ms. Dolan?
Just to wrap up this slide, as I said, the county property that was originally acquired for the bus depot, under no build, no development, under the planning board proposal, 8%, although the county executive has indicated an interest in maybe not having any development on that property. I'm sure that they will weigh in at some point. The 1994 plan had limited imperviousness to 15% on that property. The property that surrounds the county detention center is it's quite large, owned by the county. The developed portion of that is quite small. Again, it's about existing 4.2% impervious. They're proposing a small expansion of that facility. It would end up being 4.5% impervious. So we're proposing both in the no-build and the planning board draft to keep it at that expanded footprint. And the executive said that they are satisfied with that allowance. And the 1994 plan gave a 15%. So again, we're reducing the potential for imperviousness there as well. On the property, Pulte King properties, no build, you would probably have to put an RDT zone on those properties to retain them in their current status. The planning board recommends the rural neighborhood cluster zone with a 10% imperviousness cap. The 1994 plan recommended RE1 TDR, as Councilmember Leventhal was just indicating, and we estimated the imperviousness under that scenario around 12.5%, although there was no cap or limit put on it. So if you look at the imperviousness in the two sensitive subwatersheds under these three particular scenarios, and the appendix to the plan has, we tested many scenarios, and it has that information in the appendix to the plan. Under no build, of course, very low imperviousness, less than 2%. The planning board recommendation has in 110, 10.1%, in 111, 13.8%. So those are relatively high, but still in the protective area. The 1994 plan would have resulted in about 14.1 or 15.1. That's pretty high for those two sensitive subwatersheds. Then if you look at that whole area in the light green that I showed earlier, the whole area of 10 Mile Creek, under the no build, it's about a little bit more than 4% impervious. The planning board recommendation results in approximately 8% imperviousness overall, taking into account both the ag reserve and the developed portions proposed for development. And the 1994 plan would have resulted in close to 10%. So that's that analysis. Just to show in a bar graph form the results of the imperviousness analysis for the three scenarios. In the purple, the 1994 plan, in the orange, the planning board draft, and the existing conditions, so you can see the change from existing conditions. You can see 206, as I said, already has 16% imperviousness. Under the either the planning board draft or the 1994 plan, it would be in the 30% range there. 202, which is also affected by that subwatershed, while there might not be a lot of development in that, it's affected by 206, so it also has fairly high. You can see 110 and 111 have very low imperviousness. The difference between what's there and what's being proposed, there's going to be quite a bit of difference in those two subwatersheds. But you can see overall here, and again on the watershed basis. Now, in response to the question about quality that Councilmember Berliner raised earlier, and when we come to the committee, I'll have a few more slides. I just didn't want to really overwhelm this what I'd hoped would be a short briefing, but is important to explain as much as we can at this point to the full council. The overall watershed, if it remains below 8%, we feel that in general it would stay in good quality condition. Now, it would be at the lower end of good rather the higher end of good where it is now. If you look at the excellent, good, fair, poor that the county rates streams, that the Department of Environmental Protection rates streams, it would stay mostly in the good category with the exception of these two subwatersheds, 206 and 202, would probably be in the fair category. Certainly 206 would be in the fair category. It is in the fair category now. It's not going to improve.
Ms. Dolan, Councilmember Andrews has a question.
Thanks. Do you has the council gotten the technical analysis that was done to back up
Yes.
those
It's
arguments?
in the appendix. We did not provide a hard copy. The appendix is over 400 pages. We will be happy to provide you a printed copy. It's available online. Just let me know if you need a printed copy. I'd be happy to provide it.
Right. The one of the points I think that's important to understand is what is the imperviousness in areas that are very close to the streams? One can have an 8% average for the whole watershed, but it matters a lot where the imperviousness is in
Yes.
relation to the streams themselves.
Yes, and I'm going to show you some slides of that
Okay.
that illustrate this in a more spatial way. So we'll flip to those next. In this slide shows the existing conditions, as I said, era 206. You can see the darker colors have the higher imperviousness. The darkest is over 15%, and then it scales down. These are kind of the breakdowns. 12 to 15 is a little sketchy in terms of what you can, some areas of the county you can maintain good quality, up to 15%. Some areas, 10% is the absolute minimum. So there's 12 to 15, there's 10 to 12, 8 to 10, 5 to 8. Anything in the below, let's say 8% is going to be probably generally in the good category. So you can see 206 under today's conditions is obviously the most affected. 202, which receives water from it, and 302, which receives, you can see the stream going right down there, and the effect that that has. All the rest of the watershed has very low imperviousness. So flip to the next slide. Under the 1994 plan, this is what scared us when we looked at this and saw that the imperviousness would be very high both in 206 and 202 and in 110, 111, and the main stem as it moves down, the 302, 303B, 304. So you can see the effect of the development that we were concerned about, and when we spoke to the council, we were not confident that the 1994 plan would be sufficiently protective. So what the planning board draft is proposing shows something that's in between the two, something that's still, you can see the effect of development on the east side of I-270 and 206 that affects 202. And you can see that both 110 and 111 are affected as well, 111 more than 110 in terms of imperviousness. And the effect as it goes downstream, the farther you get downstream, you can get down to 304D, it's more diluted. The agricultural land that's been preserved is contributing to the overall health of the stream at that point. But as Councilmember Andrews was just suggesting, you can see the effect in the different subwatersheds depending on where the development is located.
Ms. Dolan, I have a quick question for you because we've talked a lot about imperviousness affecting water quality, but in fact it is not the only factor that affects water
Correct.
quality. And so looking at the current situation that we have regarding imperviousness, but also factoring in best management practices, something that you talked about at the beginning of your presentation. Can you talk a little bit about how the evolution of that has actually been able to help mitigate some of the effects that come about as a result of imperviousness?
Sure. The environmental site design, or ESD, is an advance in stormwater management. Again, nothing can offset completely the effects of development, but the idea of environmental site design is it more closely mimics natural conditions. It works to, instead of collecting all the stormwater into a large pond or a large retention area and discharging it at one point to the stream, what it does is requires that there be smaller areas of infiltration located all the way through a development, and that those areas more gradually retain and infiltrate water in a way that is similar, although still more concentrated than it would be if water was infiltrating over, let's say, a large field or a forest. And then that water is more gradually discharged through the groundwater. All of these facilities, for the most part, have some sort of an overflow system, so that if there's a large storm, water is discharged directly to the stream, albeit usually through a very much smaller pipe, so that it's discharged more gradually. So that's what it does. It more closely mimics the natural system. It is better than both more traditional stormwater management and the stormwater management that's been applied in special protection areas in the more recently developed portion of Clarksburg, which is doing a pretty good job. But this, we anticipate will do a better job. We don't know how much better. We don't know how it would affect a sensitive watershed like this. So we are proposing, in addition to impervious limitations, protecting the existing forest areas, the existing small streams that are protected by our stream buffer requirements, requiring reforestation of stream buffers. It's a complex of things that includes both the stormwater management piece and the protection of actual resources that are doing their job now. Let's not harm the things that are doing their job now, and then let's take the areas that are, for the most part, although there are some forests that are proposed to be removed, most of the development we're proposing is in areas of cleared land, agricultural land for the most part, and that confining the development to those areas and then using the environmental site design would be the most helpful package of things that would protect the environment. Sure.
Just to add to that briefly, because I know we'll get to some of the other slides, but I want to sort of jump ahead, and correct me if I'm misstating anything here, Mary, but we, in doing the modeling that was done, did not take environmental site design into, it did take it into account? Okay.
Yes, it did.
Sorry, take that away. But the area that is zoned RNC will have 65% of the land as open space in perpetuity. And in addition to that, and again, Mary will get to this, there are wider stream buffers being recommended than we would have in any of our normal environmental guidelines, which are pretty stringent. There are wider stream buffers. We're also requiring buffers for ephemeral streams, which again is above and beyond our normal boundary, our normal environmental guidelines. And as Mary was sort of describing, it's a package. It's not just a matter of saying, do stormwater better. It's clustering the development in very tight clusters so you can retain as much land as actual open space, forested land around the streams as possible, and doing reforestation if the stream buffer had already been cleared through a previous use like agriculture.
And
Thank-
thank-
Go
And
ahead.
thanks for elaborating on that, because in fact I did not have a slide on that. So again, these are there's quite a few layers to this plan, and I was trying to keep the presentation brief.
Okay, we have 14 more slides to go. I see that Councilmember Berliner is next and Councilmember Reamer, but I do want to make sure that we try and end by at least 12:30. So if we can kind of speed through this and get through the rest of this, I know this is important and folks have a lot of great questions.
Thank you, Council President. I will be brief. I am a strong proponent of environmental site design. I do think it makes a contribution. I just want to highlight what I believe Ms. Dolan and what the second bullet on your slide is, what has changed since 1994, that there's no long-term or watershed scale monitoring to understand effect on sensitive stream systems. So it is important for us to appreciate that while environmental site design may be efficacious in lots of areas, when you get to sensitive stream systems, it is a horse of a different color. And so I just think we need to keep that in mind.
Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you. Ms. Dolan, if you accounted for ESD, how much of an impact did you attribute to ESD in your estimates?
I'm not sure quite how to answer that. We did not model without using ESD, so I can't tell you a comparison. We
Okay.
were limited on the amount of
I'd just be interested as a
funding.
follow-up to know how much reduction in runoff you attributed to environmental site design. Because the
I-
assertion was
I-
made to me that you did not account for that.
We
so-
did.
this is.
We did account for that.
New
What we
information,
don't have is the comparison.
My general question is, at what point do we discuss land use issues, transportation issues, infrastructure issues? I mean, there is a constrained.
Getting there.
Focus, okay.
Next
Because
slide.
the environmental factors
Master
are
plan
one
issues
set
are
of
next.
concerns. The council's responsible for the whole picture.
14
Absolutely.
slides to come.
In fact, let's move on to transportation. And with transportation, the recommendations, again, I'm simply going to highlight the recommendations and not go into the analysis in any great detail, but we did do our usual modeling for transportation impact and so forth. And in fact, the first thing we looked at was, can we do away with the bypass? Is there any way, maybe with a modest widening of 355 or other intersection improvements, that we do not need the bypass? The bypass goes through some very tricky topography, crosses, as originally proposed, to cross 3 streams, and so forth. But the transportation analysis we did said that we absolutely could not do without it, and certainly even providing access to the Miles Coppola property would require at least a 2-lane road. So what we did was we realigned. What we proposed was a realignment. You can see on this slide, Fred, if you would mind indicating the extension of Observation Drive as it's proposed would have proceeded farther north. We turned it into a T intersection at 355, so would avoid the third tributary that it would have to cross. But also, when the Peterson Company came in, they said, look, here's a way to even avoid having to cross the property between, if you can indicate, Redgrave Place and Stringtown Road. In that area is the Clarksburg Elementary School, and the historic elementary school is located right in that area, would be affected by grading for this road. So they proposed an alternative which would break off of Observation Drive to the west, follow Gateway Commons Drive across, follow Clarksburg Road, and then turn north. So they wanted that alternative looked at. Now that would be probably much less expensive. DOT indicated an interest in it, but felt that they would have to look at it through facility planning to look at the costs, the benefits, the traffic impacts, and so forth. So we're bringing forth 2 alternatives in this plan and saying the DOT should look at both of those alternatives through the facility planning process. The rest of the traffic should be able to be accommodated by adding additional turn lanes at selected intersections as necessary through the LATR process to accommodate the necessary movements. We would retain the Quarter City Transitway in its current alignment. You can see the black line, which would also follow the orange dash line up to 355 and continue north on 355. In a future year, obviously, this is not yet under study past ComSat, as you're probably well aware of, but retaining it in this plan. And then also the sort of a tan dashed line is the proposed bus rapid transit that was just brought forward in the transit corridors plan. So that would extend also to the town center. Then the location of the transit station, which currently is shown at the intersection of Observation Drive or the 355 bypass extended and Redgrave Place, depending on exactly how all these modes come together and where they come together, might have to look at a slightly different location of that. The board was very concerned that it continue to have a strong relationship to town center, and that if possible it remain very close to the existing location. But again, that's something that should be looked at in more detail. The other aspects of transportation in this area is that really to some extent, because Clarksburg is so far out, that it really needs to function a little bit more like a railroad town, let's say in New England, where you have fast transit from the town center to prime destinations, Shady Grove, the Germantown Transit Center, Milestone, Lake Forest. Those are areas where you could provide express service or limited limited stop ride-on service and really make improvements. Agreeably, that's an operations issue, but we think we would encourage that to be incorporated into the transit picture for Clarksburg, as well as was proposed in the 1994 plan, an internal circulator system to feed that and the CCT and the BRT for this area. So those are things that are recommended. Then some minor adjustments to the bikeways plan, a connection along Comus Road that would connect Shiloh Church Road to the Little Bennett Park and 355, and then a local bikeway connection along Clarksburg Road to connect to Stringtown Road. That completes the bikeway system. Then in terms of parks, legacy open space, the area you see outlined here in kind of a light green with a shade over it, that area is one of the top 20 interior forests in the county. And if the little sort of triangular shaped clearing that's currently a farm field were filled in, this would be one of the top 5 interior forests in the county. It's highly prized, and it also connects to major hubs. Little Bennett Park, which is mostly a natural park, and of course Black Hill, which surrounds Little Seneca Lake, also largely a natural park. So this ecological connection and just the resource itself are particularly important, and were mentioned in the original Legacy Open Space Plan as a resource that needed to be studied and boundaries defined. So we're recommending that that area be protected through Legacy Open Space. Remembering that there are a variety of tools through Legacy Open Space. It's not just park acquisition, although I'll show you on the next slide that there is a large park acquisition proposed here, but there would be certainly easements and other protections afforded some of the properties that might remain in private hands. Then in terms of parks and trails, of course, the linkage between these two major parklands is highly important. Parks is recommending a natural surface multi-user trail to connect those areas that would stay, for the most part, out of the stream buffer, and would serve both the community of Clarksburg and certainly most closely the neighborhood that would be associated with Cabin Branch and the Pulte and King properties. They would have 5 trailheads, small gravel parking lots where people could enter the trail system from there. And they would like to provide, where the orange asterisk is located, or somewhere in that area, a neighborhood, natural resource-based neighborhood park of at least 10 acres. Now, this would not have courts or large facilities in it that would create imperviousness. They're proposing picnic areas, play fields, things that are pretty gentle on the land for that area. But at the time when the council in 1994 decided to change the recommendation here from the rural zone to the RE1 TDR zone and add a lot more housing here, Parks did not have an opportunity, because that was done so late in the process, to recommend a park to serve those new homes. So they're bringing that recommendation forward in this plan. I will turn the land use recommendations over to Fred Boyd, and I will switch seats so I can.
No, that's okay.
Oh, you speak from there.
I can click from here. Thank you.
Mhm.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, council members. I am Fred Boyd. I am a community planner with the Area 3 planning team. And I am going to talk briefly, I hope, about the land use recommendations that are associated with this plan. for Councilmember Reamer, I will note that in a very great way, the land use recommendations in this plan arise from the environmental work that was done. We based our recommendations in large part on the findings and conclusions of our environmental consultants. And that's what led us to what I am about to briefly describe for you now. We will start east of I-270. You are looking at the main property locations that we have been discussing, so this will just be a refresher. Here is I-270. We're talking largely about the area between I-270 and Maryland 355 and the Observation Drive Extended CCT corridor. Here are the existing stations. In purple is the Egan-Matlin property, High Point Catering, and immediately adjacent to it and slightly to the south are the Miles Coppola properties. The bypass, I will note, is designed to largely provide primary means of access to the Miles Coppola property. Keep in mind, in this part of the Clarksburg planning area, the aim of this draft was to complement development in the town center. And in succeeding slides, I will show you the relationship among the town center, this area, and other parts of Clarksburg. As I said, the idea is complementary development. To begin with, for the Egan-Matlin property, that means largely residential development. This is in keeping with the recommendations that were made in 1994. They are a slight adjustment from a floating plan development zone in the 1994 plan to a Euclidean R200 zone with a cluster recommendation in this plan. But broadly speaking, the densities that we're talking about for this property are approximately the same. The cluster will preserve some open space.
Can I
Mr.
clarify,
Reamer.
what is it?
We
Can
have
you just
clarifying questions.
say that again in more layman's terms? What does that mean in terms of development? What kind of structures and things like that?
This is a residential recommendation. It is a lower density single family development recommendation. The housing mix on Egan-Matlin, we anticipate, will be it'll be entirely single family houses. Some of those will be attached. Many more of them we anticipate will be detached. The cluster recommendation is designed to increase the open space, particularly in this stream valley here, and to continue to protect, insofar as we can, those areas and to maximize the amount of undeveloped open space. The thread, if you will, for the residential development that we're recommending in particular is a substantial increase in the amount of undeveloped open space as a means of reducing imperviousness and maintaining water quality in that way. The impervious limit that we do have on this piece of property, correct me if I'm wrong, Mary, this approximates the level of imperviousness that you would ordinarily see in the R200 zone. So we are, as much as we can, maintaining the 1994 plan's goals, objectives, and to some extent its recommendations for this piece of property, while tweaking them slightly to increase the amount of undeveloped open space and to provide a clear limit on imperviousness. And as you can see here, here is where the town center is in relation to this piece of property, and here is coming up will be the Miles Coppola property. And finally, we are going to endeavor, as part of any development on the Egan-Matlin property, to restore stream buffers that are now, Mary, they are largely unforested and bare of vegetation or landscaping of any kind. It's largely mowed, and we would like to restore those in a more natural setting. And there's the area of disturbance for the Egan Mountain property. Moving a little bit to the south, the desire here is for a broader mix of uses because we have moved a little bit closer to the town center. And here we are trying to, and I do want to, I can't emphasize this enough, complement and not confront or otherwise impinge on development that we anticipate will occur in the town center naturally. That was a very important characterization and a very important aim of our recommendations on this piece of property. This also reflects a clear trend away from the auto-oriented employment activities that were recommended actually in Clarksburg going back to the 1968 plan that were recommended for this entire corridor. And we are also recognizing that office work does not occur the same way in 2013 that it occurred in 1993. And we are mindful of that, and we are trying to direct development on this piece of property towards a broader mix of uses to incorporate some residential development because we believe that the town center in particular and this area as it develops in the future will benefit from what we now colloquially call more rooftops. And this is a satisfactory place to do that. The plan acknowledges the possibility of what Mary called specialty retail with a somewhat broader attraction than just local residents. We are recommending one of the commercial residential zones. We are recommending an overall density of 0.75 for this piece of property. I will note that this piece of property was also in a planned development zone that had a density, an overall upper limit density of 0.75 as well. It is much more difficult to forecast what would have happened on this piece of property in the MXPD format. The land use plan in 1994 did show employment uses as well as residential uses, but it's very difficult to prognosticate on what might have happened on the residential side on this piece of property. The 0.75 is a density that will enable the optional method for this piece of property should that occur, although we recognize that a density of 0.75 on a 100-acre piece of property does allow for a substantial amount of potential development on this piece of property. There is an impervious cap of 25% on this piece, which we hope will help us concentrate development in the area of disturbance that I just showed, which will again protect the substantial and relatively good quality forest that exists on this site. And to minimize the amount of those areas that need to be cleared or removed. And in addition to that, we are hopeful that an optional method project will generate some of the public benefits that we do consider important for this piece of property. In the historic district, our thinking was very strongly influenced by the idea that the most desirable thing that can happen in the Clarksburg Historic District is that there can be the broadest amount of structural rehabilitation, the most number of buildings refurbished for the widest variety of uses. And we started from the premise that the existing, for lack of a better phrase, hodgepodge of residential and commercial zones in the historic district would not accomplish those vital preservation goals. So here we settled on the commercial residential neighborhood, the least intense of the commercial residential family of zones, because it will broaden the uses somewhat, but not too much. to allow for rehabilitation, to allow for some varying of uses. We want to emphasize that the very strong guidelines for the historic district that are set out in the 1994 plan will be retained. And in addition to that, that there are historic district specific guidelines that must also be adhered to as this development, as any development on this piece of property proceeds. There is no imperviousness cap here. The maximum density is as low as we could set it for the commercial residential zones, an overall floor area ratio of 0.25, which we believe will allow for the mixing of uses at scales and intensities and building heights that are appropriate to this important piece of Clarksburg's development. I will note that because of the way the boundaries are set through here in this area, we the draft recommends that this area here at the intersection of Stringtown Road and 355 retain its existing regime of zones. The committees may wish to evaluate that as part of their discussions. Moving west of I-270, this is a picture of the major properties that we are dealing with. When Mary referred to the Clarkwood property in her discussion in that table that she showed you, it is this brown landlocked piece of property, interior piece of property here that is just south of what we will call the former depot site and the correctional facilities properties. In pink are the Pulte and King properties. Let me just note the importance of, as you can see here, the relationships between this area and Cabin Branch in the town center. The Pulte and King properties are highlighted in this drawing, along with the future, we hope, conservation park in this area. Here, as Mary alluded to earlier, we are reducing densities and increasing the amount of undeveloped open space. That is the 65% open space that Gwen alluded to a few minutes ago. And we are recommending the rural neighborhood cluster zone precisely because it allows us to set that percentage as undeveloped open space. And it also allows for a fairly broad range of almost entirely single-family detached and attached houses. It also requires a broad variety of lot sizes, so this is an area in which we will be able to achieve big lots, little lots, attached lots, and lots in between. The zone requires that. Of particular importance are the specified design guidelines, which are designed for both developers who are going to develop this piece of property and for the people who do the reviews of those properties to understand with some precision what sets of design guidelines we are endeavoring to achieve on this piece of property. And as we review these and as the planning board considers them, and this is particularly useful in those scenarios in which some time elapses between the recommendations of a plan and the actual development of the plan. So whatever collection of 5 people are sitting on the planning board, when a property in this area comes forward, they will understand what set of guidelines we had in mind for this piece of property. That is also particularly important. Here we are also maintaining the 1994 plan's commitment to a transition from the town center west across this area to the ag reserve in this area west of Shiloh Church Road. There's 10% imperviousness count in this area that we continue to believe will, in combination with environmental site design and a wide variety of other tools enable us to maintain water quality in this sensitive area. And finally, there is a historic house on this piece of property, and we will be requiring anyone who develops in this area to restore that house and provide for it a suitable environmental setting.
Fred, can I just add one thing, which is
Of
this
course.
shows you, again, in the white is the developable area. Everything else in green, whoop,
You got what I did.
everything else in green that in the slide you just saw
Go
would
back.
be perpetual open space, including the buffers around the stream. That's why it's sort of the long fingers that you saw, and the 65% open space. And I think that that's an important image. It didn't show up maybe as clearly because the gray doesn't stand out with the green as clearly, but the gray is the developable area. You can see the fingers of the streams with the wider stream buffers that we discussed briefly before.
Councilmember Florine.
Gwen or someone, do you have a map that shows, you're showing the town center. Is that everything that's approved for the town center? The things around this area? I think it's important, well, at least when we get to committee. Can you have a map, a visual that shows everything that's been approved in the town center and also in Cabin Branch? Because to look at this, one might think that nothing is occurring there. And of course, there's a major development occurring in that white space.
We have that slide for Cabin Branch, and we showed it to the planning board as part of their deliberations.
Well, if you
and we will be able to show
could
it to
bring
you
it
as
up,
well.
so council members see that, because it's incomplete. I don't know if what you're showing on the rest of Clarksburg is also complete. At least, if you could show what's approved as well as what's in place, I think it would be helpful for the conversation. Thank you.
All right, Fred, go ahead.
Finally, on the land west of I-270 that is owned by Montgomery County, we are retaining the existing residential zones there. As Mary noted, there is significant forest on this area that we will be protecting through legacy open spaces. And as you can see, the gold outline shows the county properties, and you can see the extent to which we are anticipating some form of protection for these pieces of property through the legacy open space system. There are substantial impervious limits on these pieces of property as well. 4.5% on the portion nearest the detention center, which reflects our understanding of the relatively low amount of additional development that is proposed for the detention center, and an 8% cap on the area more immediately adjacent to the interchange between I-270 and Maryland 121, which was, as we noted, once under evaluation as the depot site, but which we are now hopeful can sustain very minimal development under those kinds of guidelines. And that is it.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that very thorough presentation. I know that my colleagues, both on the T&E committee and on the Fed committee, look forward to great work sessions. I know that I, as the district council member, certainly look forward to this as well. This is going to be a great collaboration between all of us in trying to make sure that we deliver on the ultimate vision that's so important to those Clarksburg residents. With that, we are going to close. I want my colleagues to know that to make sure that you have time, since we ran a little bit over, we will reconvene at 1:45. And so we'll be back here at 1:45. We are adjourned.
A quick reminder of the tour tomorrow morning at 9:30. Hopefully, as many of you as possible or your staffs can join us.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Sensible shoes for the tour.